Kevin.
And we're from the Neville Public Museum. Today we're going to show you some artifacts that are in our collection here at the museum that are not normally on display like some of the things you see around us here. They're up in our collection storage area. And the thing that all these artifacts have in common is that they've been replaced by one single object. Today, many people carry these artifacts, which are from the last 150 years, around in their pocket in the form of one single phone. So that's what we're going to look at today. Items from our museum collection that have been replaced by the cell phone.
So speaking of telephones, Ryan, what is this one?
All right, so this is a phone that was manufactured by a company called the American Electric Company. And they made a lot of different phones. The company started in the 1880s. This phone, though, is probably from the 1950s or 60s. Probably was used in an office or something like that. And this phone actually is what we call a rotary phone. It looks a little bit different than the phones that you've probably used before. The company, American Electric, was a pretty big phone maker for a long time, but by the 1980s, their company had kind of fallen out of favor and was replaced by other phones. So, Kevin, do you know how this rotary phone works?
Well, I used to have one of these in my house when I was growing up. Yes, it's not that long ago that they went out of favor or out of, I guess, fashion even as technology advanced. But yeah, I mean, as you can see here, it's interesting about telephones. Well, first of all, this is much later in time, but the first telephones, we could go back to the late 1600s. And in fact, if you think about it, it was really two tin cans with a string between them. People would listen that way. But we can credit Alexander Graham Bell, the great Scottish inventor. And that was March 10th of 1876, where the first telephone call was ever made, actually, in Massachusetts. Said Alexander, of course, he was Scottish. He gets on the phone, and his assistant is there on the other line. He cranks it. He says,
"Mr. Watson, come here. I want you."
And from there, it changed the world. The way we actually communicate, it was a watershed moment, and patents were taken out after that, many of them. And then, actually, it was only 6 years later, in 1882, that the first phones were installed in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So, in fact, it was Henry Hagemeister, who was a big beer baron, and he had an office at his house, and he had a phone connecting the two of those together. So, nowadays, we have thousands and thousands of phone lines. Of course, things are changing. But this phone in particular, from the mid-20th century, in this case, many, many years after that first Alexander Graham Bell phone call was made, this was at about time when there were about 40,000 telephones in Green Bay. So these would have been used where you'd have, in this case, you can dial 0 for the operator, and it would patch you through to the operator. Or in this case, when this was used, there were probably only 4 or 5 digits that you would have to dial, in this case, rotate to get to the number that you were trying to call.
Excellent. Yeah, what I thought was really interesting is the dialing function. What that really does is it creates a tone that the phone then uses to connect to the right number. It used to be that you would just pick up your old phone line and it would connect to an operator, and they would physically have to take a plug out of one socket, put it into a different socket in order to connect you to the person you wanted to talk to. This phone, though, sent a series of different sounds to the phone company, and it kind of electrified or automated that process. And then, of course, later, modern day phones that you might even have today, you just push a button. So instead of having to dial all those numbers, you just push the buttons that you want. And that was a technology that took quite a while to come into fashion. That didn't really overtake the rotary phone until about the 1980s or the 1990s. So when Kevin and I said that we had these rotary phones in our houses when we were younger, I used it all the time. I remember calling my friends on a phone like this.
Well, you have to remember numbers nowadays. You don't even have to. Your phone is all there with your phone book in it. But back then, you'd have to go to a phone book and try to find their numbers too. So things have changed. Things have gotten smaller, but of course, a lot more efficient in how we communicate. So what's very interesting, of course, times have changed, and people watching this video probably never use these anyway. But today, the landline is really kind of a thing of the past. Most people in Brown County, and in fact in North America, have something like this, the mobile phone, the cell phone.
Yep, I looked up the statistic. Over 50% of the people now don't have a phone connected to their house, so they're just using their cell phones, and of course, no need for anything like this, for wires. Nowadays, the signal just travels through the air into cell phone towers instead of under or over power lines and other types of wires that the phone signal will go through.
Last fun fact about area code 920, that came into existence in 1997. So that's the region of Green Bay and this area of northeastern Wisconsin. So it's not that long ago. So Ryan, what is our next object here that is in our phone? Although this is quite big to fit in your phone. What is
It is. So this is called a graphophone, and this was an early way that people could listen to music and recordings in their home.
Right, so unlike the phonograph, which Thomas Edison had invented, this one, Alexander Graham Bell, evidently the year after the phone, first phone call that he made in 1876 or 1877, he's starting to send out patents and producing this unique device, which was a new way to record sound. Now, for the first time, you could actually listen at home to the sounds of a symphony or folk music or whatever it might have been, even the news coming into your house now for the first time, being recorded on these little cylinders. So as you'd crank this handle, this cylinder would turn around and actually there would be a large megaphone, a horn,
tube.
Yeah, that would actually cast the sound out. And it would play via this little tiny, we call it a stylus. It's very small, little, in fact, piece of wood that would be recorded on there, and then it would cause it to wave back and forth. Do you know how that worked exactly?
I do. I think this is really interesting. Now, you can see this little blue cylinder tube here. On Thomas Edison's original invention, it was a piece of iron or steel, and he used almost like a tin foil that covered it. And on that tin foil were little tiny grooves. And if you were to use a microscope and zoom way in on this, what you would see, it would be like peaks and valleys, peaks and troughs. And as it spun, that stylus would move up and down. And the up and down produced the different sound frequencies, which then came out that big horn, and you could hear whatever was recorded on the disc. This one, however, the Graphophone, one of the big improvements was that instead of doing it on this metal tinfoil cylinder, which was easy to scratch or break, it used a wax cylinder, which was much more sturdy and it wouldn't break as easily. The other thing is that instead of the stylus moving up and down through the grooves, it wiggled side to side. And that was another big improvement that kind of helped this be a more reliable and durable piece of equipment. And it was an improvement over Thomas Edison's invention. And of course, later on, there were improvements on this as well.
So it got smaller and smaller, really, yeah, and it got more and more high fidelity. Sound got better, and eventually this cylinder becomes what you think of as the record, right? The record player that came much later, and then the CD and DVDs, and now we don't even use those because all the songs, you can have thousands of them on your phone or on your iPod, and it's digital sounds now, digital recordings, but it's the same principle of recording a sound and playing it back again for others. So the world changed with some of these inventions, these patents, and yes, like we were talking about earlier, people were more inclined to not have to go out to concerts or theaters to necessarily see live performances, although we still do for another kind of reason. But this was a way that you could sit at home and hear music from orchestras from all over the world. If you're lucky enough to have one of these. And this is from 1897, we believe, based on the last patent that's on there. So the Alexander Graham Bell Graphophone. So I think we're going to have to check out the next object here. I think it's one of the most important things in our phone that we use more than anything now. What are they even calling? It's the
Camera.
The camera.
Let's go.
We're back.
All right. Wow.
What are we looking at? We're going to find the cameras here and put our gloves on, our specialty artifact gloves.
Yeah, so what is this, Kevin? What is this camera exactly? What's going on?
Well, it looks kind of familiar maybe to some people, but this is actually called a foldable camera, but it's from the Zeiss company of Germany. Zeiss Icon company, dates to about 1929, so just before World War II. And in fact, even before that time in Germany, this company was one of the largest camera manufacturers in the world. So what this allowed people to do for the first time, really between the late 1800s, with companies like Nikon and even Kodak. This is Kodak down here, something similar. You can see accordion style cameras. They're portable. They allow people, instead of having to go sit in a studio, they can now take their memories and record them in real time onto a piece of film. So, but before that, of course, there were other ways that people recorded them, right?
Yeah, so the oldest camera is actually recorded onto little pieces of glass. And you probably might have heard the term negative before. And that's what they would call those early things that the cameras would produce, whether it was on glass or film. What that really meant, it was the opposite of what the picture really looked like. The areas that were lighter were dark, the areas that were darker in real life were light on the negative. And then the photographer would take that piece of glass or the film later into a dark room, where there would be no other interference from light, and they would use different chemicals and processes to produce the positive image, which is what we normally think of when we think of pictures today. Of course, nowadays photography has changed quite a bit. About 20-ish years ago was really when digital photography started, and that process no longer really creates a negative. It just creates a positive straight away.
So, as such, on our phone, most people enjoy taking photographs nowadays. You go to any sporting event or program, or even family photos are all saved. So, for instance, on here, you just click on the camera icon, and cameras have gotten so much better now. This little camera on the back records the information onto this computer chip. This tiny chip, the size of my finger, 16 gigabytes, thousands of photographs can fit onto something this small. 100 years ago, this would have blown people's minds. So how things have changed with the digital technology, cameras are getting a lot better, and nowadays it's all from that into our phone. Don't have to process it, although if you want to, you can still get it printed out, take it to your photo processing store and still get a hard copy made if you want.
Yep. What once took hours to take a photograph and get it developed, now it takes seconds, and it's quicker to just load it up on your computer than it was to develop it back in those days. So huge improvements in technology.
What's next? We got something else that was in the camera. It's
another great piece of technology that looks very familiar, but actually is very different from what we're probably using today. Let's go check it out. Oh, hey Kevin, what are you doing here?
Look what I found, Ryan. This is an old something that looks familiar.
Yeah, I think I might have one of these at home actually, an old laptop.
Guess where this was? This came from the museum. This was used by the museum staff going back to at least the year 2000. So it's almost 20 years. Almost 20 years ago, yeah. So it's a gateway. So a gateway was a company. You don't really see them as much anymore. They've kind of been dwarfed somewhat. But at the time, they were kind of pioneers in the computer business.
Yeah, I didn't realize this because I've had Gateway computers before in my life, and if you'll notice, their logo here is actually white and black splotches because they were founded in Iowa. And they wanted to kind of tell everybody that they were this small town company from Iowa, so they made their logo cow spots. And they were pretty innovative. They were one of the first companies that offered an entire computing system, including the monitor and the keyboard and the computer for under $1,000, which was a big deal at that time. And they also were actually one of the creators of the very first smart TV, which today, it's not even every TV you can buy is smart TV. It's still kind of a new growing technology, but they were making them back in 1997, which is pretty amazing. They were later bought up by the company Acer, and they are pretty commonly, you might see a lot of Acer laptops around today, but if you go on Gateway's website, you can still buy Gateway branded computers, which I might do, because I always liked my Gateway computers back then.
Me too. So a little statistic about this piece of technology here, in terms of how much computing power it has or had at this stage. So when it was released 17 years ago, it cost over $1,000, $1,700.
Almost $2,000.
Almost two, yeah, and it had 32 whopping megabytes of RAM. For that means it had decent computing power, but not huge. It could store 4 gigabytes of information, and just so you saw that little tiny computer chip, that's 16 gigabytes on a fingernail, so that's a fourth of what that is on this whole laptop. The new iPhone 8 has 2 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of internal memory, so that just goes to show in one. All of this compressed computing power. So it's basically 125 times more powerful than this computer.
In your pocket.
In your pocket.
In your pocket.
So, and that of course costs much less, these computers do, or the phones do now, compared to laptops even more. Amazing that all of this can now also fit into your pocket.
Yep. This computer actually has 2 different technologies that this one does not have though. This one you can put CDs into, and nowadays lots of new computers can't do that. They do that to save space because we don't need CDs and DVDs to go in computers as much. This one also has a little slot here for what they used to call a floppy disk or a 3/8 disk, and that was kind of what came before the CD in early computers.
And then ultimately led to the USB port, which is really what we use now to import information. So, but what that doesn't have is this fancy screen that spins around like that.
Yeah, I
so
like
you can
that.
use it as a tablet. So it's a 2-in-1 device. So
Yep.
pretty amazing technology and how it's changed over the last 150 years.
And again, these are things that the phone in my pocket right now is much more powerful than this computer. And really, I think that calling it just a phone or a cell phone is really kind of unfair to this device. I mean, this technology is amazing. 20 years ago, you would need like 50 of these computers to produce the same amount of computing power that one of these iPhones can produce. And really, making phone calls is like the thing I do the least on my phone. So I'm kind of proposing that instead of calling them phones, we start calling them microcomputers that can make phone calls, because I think that's a much better name for what we are all kind of carrying around with us right now.
And the future is holograms, which now you can get apps for that. You can see little things actually like pop out of your phone. So using them in a variety of ways. So I'm sure you guys, you may not have one, you're not allowed them in school perhaps, but of course it is a technology that is encompassing hundreds of years of technology so that we can make our lives a little bit more simple, but also more interesting. So the power of technology through time.